Hi class, hope everybody's doing well today. This video is going to continue talking about the good life by serving as a transition into discussing Aristotle and his virtue theory. In the video, we're going to talk about Aristotle, Eudaimonia, and introduce his virtuous activity theory, but then we're going to turn to his reasons for rejecting some competing common conceptions of the good life, especially hedonism. And here we'll look at his evil pleasures argument, the additional goods argument, and the swine argument. So Aristotle in this reading is investigating what he refers to as Eudaimonia. This is just a Greek word that's sometimes translated happiness, but this isn't a very good translation because he doesn't mean to pick out a subjective state of mind or an experience like pleasure or enjoyment, like the hedonist does. Instead, he's using the word happiness much more generally, just to refer to the ultimate good of a human life, whatever that turns out to be. So when Aristotle says Eudaimonia, translated as happiness in our reading, is the highest good, he's not committing himself to hedonism. A better translation would actually be human flourishing. So when you see the word happiness in the Aristotle reading, try to change that in your mind to human flourishing, the good life, or well-being. Now, if Eudaimonia refers to the ultimate good or proper aim of a human life, Aristotle thinks it's going to need to meet certain criteria. Whatever human flourishing or living well turns out to be, it's going to have to be a complete and sufficient good. The idea is that it needs to represent the best human life, and so there can't be anything lacking from it. And that means the good, whatever it is, must be desired for its own sake. It needs to be an intrinsic good in order to serve as the standard of a human life. And it must not be desired for the sake of anything else. So it can't be instrumentally good. And it must satisfy all of our intrinsic desires, because if it didn't, there'd be something lacking and it wouldn't be sufficient. Moreover, he thinks that it must be a stable good. If it's going to be a proper aim of a human life, it needs to be consistent so that we don't have a constantly moving target. So now the question becomes, what kind of thing meets this criteria? Aristotle says that with regard to what eudaimonia is, people differ. His claim here is that there's disagreement about the answer to the good life. His claim isn't that the good life is different from person to person. It's just that people have different beliefs about it. And now he says, the many do not give the same account as the wise. So common beliefs about what the good life is are not going to actually be accepted by people who think carefully and rationally about it. And he says because the former, the popular view, is that the good life is something obvious and straightforward, like getting pleasure, wealth, or honor. But he thinks that the wise, when they think about this, they realize that these kind of lives that are aimed at pleasure, wealth, and honor don't actually live up to rational scrutiny when we try to figure out the proper aim of a human life. You can think of these different popular ideas about the good life in terms of whose lives come to mind as examples when you think about the kinds of lives people often try to emulate. Sometimes when people are trying to aim at a good life, they look at examples around them and say, hey, they look like they're living a good life. I'm going to try to copy them in order to get to a good life. Some people try to copy rich billionaires. They look at people like Elon Musk. They're like, oh, that looks like a pretty good life. So I'm just going to do that. I'm going to try to get as much money as I can. Other people might look to politicians, public servants, and military figures as inspiration for how to live a good life. And when you look at those lives, you might say they seem to be aimed at gaining honor, for instance. Or other people, they might try to emulate the lives of influencers that they see on Instagram. Now, the lives you see on Instagram are often very different than what these people's real lives are. But the life that they show on Instagram might serve as an ideal, and people are like, I'm going to try to do that. They see people on Instagram, they have these pictures where they're traveling, they're having good times with their kids, they're eating good food. It looks like they're having really exciting experiences, and they think, oh, that looks like a really good life. I'm going to try to emulate that. Those are the people that are aiming at pleasure in their lives. But Aristotle thinks that those popular ways of trying to discover the aim of a good life are mistaken. Why? Well, he says eudaimonia can't be accumulating wealth because the life of money-making is one undertaking under compulsion, and wealth is evidently not the good we're seeking, for it's merely useful for the sake of something else. So if you look at people trying to get money, well, they're trying to get money in order to meet certain needs, to pay for food, to pay for rent, to pay for drink, to pay for travel. And so it looks like they don't really want money. They just want the thing that money helps them get. And so money can't be the ultimate aim of a human life, because now we call that which is in itself worthy of pursuit more final than that which is worthy of pursuit for the sake of something else. So his claim here is just that the ultimate good must be intrinsically valuable, but wealth only has instrumental value. Well, what about the life of honor, though? Well, he says eudaimonia can't be the accumulation of honor either, because he says it seems too superficial to be what we're looking for, since it's thought to depend on those who bestow honor rather than on him who receives it. But the good we divine to be something proper to a human and not easily taken from him. So Aristotle's point here is that the ultimate good of a human life should be a feature of that life, rather than a feature of how other people perceive that life. And he says receiving honor is a matter of other people perceiving you a certain way. But that perception is a feature of them. It's not a feature of you. If it's not a feature of you, how can it make your life better? Similarly, he says honor, insofar as it's a matter of other people's perceptions, those perceptions can change, and that makes the aim of a good life, if it were honor, it wouldn't be stable. It'd be a constantly moving target. And so that can't be the proper aim of a good life. Now, the life of pleasure, that's what's advocated by hedonism. Pleasure does seem to be an improvement in a couple ways. Firstly, unlike wealth, we do seem to desire pleasure just for its own sake. Unlike honor, pleasure does seem to be a feature of a person's own life rather than a feature of other people's perception of that life. And all people seem to be motivated by pleasure. Across times, across cultures, people desire their own pleasure. And in that way, this would provide us with a stable aim for a good life. But Aristotle thinks this, even here, when we reflect a little bit more, we'll see that this too can't be the ultimate good for a human life. Why not? Well, his first argument you see hinted at here. He says, in reply to those who bring forward the disgraceful pleasures, one might answer thus, that the pleasures are desirable, but not from these sources, as wealth is desirable, but not as the reward of betrayal. Aristotle is agreeing with the hedonist that pleasure is often intrinsically valuable, but he's defending that claim from an objection. There's this worry that, well, what about people who get pleasure from killing other people, for instance? He says the answer to that objection is to say that pleasure is not always intrinsically valuable. The value of pleasure depends upon where you get it. But this hints at an argument against hedonism presented in chapter 4. This argument from evil pleasures. It says, if hedonism is true, if pleasure is the only thing that's intrinsically good for a person, then pleasure from evil deeds is as desirable as pleasure from good deeds. Well, pleasure from evil deeds is not as desirable as pleasure from good deeds. So compare two lives, one person who's getting pleasure from killing people, the other person who's getting pleasure from helping people. Which one seems more desirable? Well, I'd rather have a world with that person who gets pleasure from helping people. Therefore, hedonism should be false. So you can see this idea when Aristotle says that it seems to be clear then that neither is pleasure the ultimate good, nor is all pleasure desirable, and that some pleasures are desirable in themselves, differing in kind or in their sources from the others. There is, however, a worry with this argument against hedonism, and the worry is that it might seem to confuse moral goodness with goodness for a person, with a person's own well-being. Hedonists aren't trying to give a theory about what's morally good or morally desirable. Their view is that pleasure is something that's desirable for that person. So the hedonists will say that the only reason we're attracted to premise 2 is because we're thinking in terms of moral desirability instead of the desirability for that individual person that the hedonist is concerned with. There's another argument, though, in Aristotle, what we can call the argument from additional goods. It says that if a good is made more desirable by the addition of other goods, then eudaimonia cannot be the accumulation of that good. The idea is, if you can make a life better by adding other things, that shows that it wasn't actually sufficient. It didn't actually give the best life because there was more things to want. But the claim then is that a life filled with pleasure is made more desirable by the addition of other goods. You might think of this in terms of the experience machine. Compare the life of pleasure in the experience machine to the life of pleasure outside the experience machine, where you also have autonomy, authentic experiences, purpose and meaning, and other things. If that life is more desirable than a life with just pleasure without those things, then it looks like pleasure is not sufficient for a good life. Thus, eudaimonia cannot just be the accumulation of pleasure. Then there's a last argument that's often called the swine argument. The claim is that if hedonism is true, then the best life of a swine would be suitable for the life of a human. The idea here is that if pleasure is the standard of a good life, well, pigs and swine can experience pleasure, and so it looks like the hedonist says that the proper aim of a pig's life is the same as the proper aim for a human life. But the best life of a swine isn't suitable for the life of a human. To equate the best life that a human can aim for to that of a swine, many people find that comparison demeaning. Thus, people think that hedonism is false. You see, Aristotle suggests this when he says, "Now the mass of humankind are evidently quite slavish in their tastes, preferring the life of suitable to beasts." So people are oftentimes motivated by pleasure. But when you look at that, you think that human beings can aim for something more than just that life of a pig indulging in all those physical pleasures. Similarly, Aristotle goes on to claim that no one would choose to live with the intellect of a child throughout his life, however much he were to be pleased at the things that children are pleased at. The idea here is that maybe ignorance is bliss. So my children, there's a lot of things they don't understand in this world that are going on, like suffering that happens halfway around the world, for instance. They're just blissfully unaware of a lot of the terrible things that go on. Nonetheless, I would never give my children a lobotomy to keep them in that childlike state where they don't understand the world around them so that they can ignore all those terrible things that might go on. Because even if ignorance is bliss, the idea is it's only bliss, it's only pleasurable because you fail to understand all the things that you're missing. There is, of course, a possible reply on behalf of the hedonists. They might say, look, even if pleasure is the ultimate aim of a life, that doesn't mean the life of a swine would be suitable for that of a human, or that the life of a child would be suitable for that of an adult, because a swine is only capable of some pleasures, but humans are capable of many, many more. Yes, we can experience the pleasure of eating and drinking, but we can also experience the pleasure of reading. And if we just focus on the pleasures of a swine, we'd be ignoring all those other sources of pleasure that we can get. Similarly, the pleasures that a child gets, even if we're capable of getting those same pleasures, we're also capable of getting a lot more. And so if we just focused on the pleasures of a child, we'd be ignoring all those other ways we can get pleasure as well. So that's all for this video. The next video is going to begin investigating Aristotle's own proposal for identifying the nature of eudaimonia. See you then.